What's up, Wildcats? We finished chapter 10 quite literally with a cliffhanger. We had Violet climbing up to try and rescue Sunny. And unfortunately, what the device she made had hooked onto that guy with the hook hands, his hook. She climbed up, got to the top. She thinks she's about to save her sister Sunny, and sadly, she gets captured by hook hands. So here we are, chapter 11. Let's go, Wildcats. How pleasant that you could join us. How pleasant that you could join us, the hook-handed man said in a sickly sweet voice. Violet immediately tried to scurry back down the rope, but Count Olaf's assistant was too quick for her. In one movement, he hoisted her into the tower room, and with a flick of his hook, sent her rescue device clanging to the ground. Now Violet was as trapped as her sister. "I'm so glad you're here," the hook-handed man said. "I was just thinking how much I wanted to see your pretty face. Have a seat." "What are you going to do with me?" Violet asked. "I said have a seat," the hook-handed man snarled and pushed her into the chair. Violet looked around the dim and messy room. "I'm certain that over the course of your own life, you have noticed that people's rooms reflect their personalities. In my room, for instance, I have gathered a collection of objects that are important to me, including a dusty accordion, of which I play a few songs a year, a large bundle of notes on the activities of the Bolidare orphans, and a blurry photograph, taken a very long time ago, of a woman whose name is Beatrice. There are items that are very precious and dear. These are items that are very precious and dear to me." The tower room held objects that were very dear and precious to Count Olaf. And they were terrible things. There were scraps of paper on which he had written his evil ideas in an intelligible scrawl, lying in messy piles on top of the copy of the nuptial laws he had taken from Klaus. There were a few chairs and a handful of candles, which were giving off flickering shadows. Littered all over the floor, empty wine bottles and dirty dishes. But most of all were the drawings and paintings of carvings of eyes, big and small, all over the room. There were eyes painted on the ceiling and scattered into grimy wooden floors. There were eyes scrawled along the windowsill, and one big eye painted on the knob of the door that led to the stairways. It was a terrible place. The hook-handed man reached into his pocket of his greasy overcoat and pulled out a walkie-talkie. With some difficulty, he pushed the button and waited a moment. "Boss, it's me," he said. "Your blushing bride just climbed up here and tried to rescue the biting brat." He paused as Count Olaf said something. I don't know, with some sort of rope she got up here." "It was a grappling hook," said Violet, and tore off a sleeve of her nightgown to make a bandage for her shoulder. "I made it myself." "She says it was her grappling hook," the hook-handed man said to the walkie-talkie. "I don't know, boss. Yes, boss. Yes, boss. Of course I understand she's yours. Yes, boss." He pushed a button to disconnect the line and then turned to face Violet. "Count Olaf is very displeased with his bride." "I'm not his bride," said Violet bitterly. "Very soon you will be," the hook-handed man said, wagging his hook in the way most people would wag a finger. "In the meantime, however, I have to go fetch your brother. The three of you will be locked in this room until night falls. That way, Count Olaf can be sure you will stay out of mischief." With that, the hook-handed man stomped out of the room. Violet heard the door lock behind him and then listened to his footsteps fading down the stairs. She immediately went over to Sunny and put a hand on her little head. Afraid to untie or untape her sister for fear of incurring, a word which here means bringing about, Count Olaf's wrath, Violet stroked Sunny's hair and murmured that everything would be all right. But of course, everything was not all right. Everything was all wrong. As the first light of the morning trickled into the tower, Violet reflected on all the awful things she and her siblings had recently experienced. Their parents had died suddenly and horribly. Mrs. Poe had brought them ugly clothing. They had moved into Count Olaf's house and were treated terribly. Mr. Poe had refused to help. They had discovered a fiendish plot involving marrying Violet and stealing the Boletaire fortune. Klaus had tried to confront Olaf with knowledge he'd learned in Justice Strauss's library, and he failed. Poor Sonny had been captured, and now Violet had tried to rescue Sonny and found herself captured. All in all, the Boletaire orphans had encountered catastrophe after catastrophe, and Violet found their situation lamentably deplorable. A phrase, blah, 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 which means it was not at all enjoyable. The sound of footsteps coming up the stairs brought Violet out of her thoughts, and soon the hook-handed man opened the door and thrust a very tired, very confused, and very scared Klaus into the room. "Here's the last orphan," the hoof-handed man said, "and now I must go help Count Olaf with the final preparations for tonight's performance. No monkey business, you two, or I'll have to tie you up and let you dangle out of the window as well." Glaring at them, he locked the door again and tromped downstairs. Klaus blinked and looked around the filthy room. He was still in his pajamas. "Well, what's happened here?" He asked Violet. Why are we up here?" "I tried to rescue Sonny," Violet said, "using an invention of mine to climb the tower." Klaus went over the window and looked down at the ground. It's so high up here," he said. "You must have been terrified." "It was very scary," she admitted, "but not as scary as marrying Count Olaf." "I'm sorry your invention didn't work," Klaus said, sadly. "The invention worked fine," Violet said, rubbing her shoulder. I just got caught, and now we're doomed. The hook-handed man said he'd keep us here till midnight, and then the marvelous marriage will take place." "Do you think you could invent something that would help us escape?" Klaus asked, looking around the room. "Maybe," said Violet, and why don't we go through those books and papers? Maybe there's something useful in there we could use." For the next few hours, Violet and Klaus searched the room in their own minds for anything that might help them. Violet looked for objects with which she could invent something. Klaus read through Count Olaf's papers and books. From time to time, they would go over to Sonny and smile at her and pat her on the head to reassure her. Occasionally, Violet and Klaus would speak to each other, but mostly they were silent, lost in their thoughts. "If I had any kerosene," Violet said around noon, "I could make a Mazel Tov cocktail with these bottles." "What is a Mazel Tov cocktail?" Klaus said. They're small bombs inside bottles. We could throw them out of the window and attract the attention of a passerby." "But we don't have any kerosene," Klaus said. They were silent for more hours. "If we were polygamists," Count said, "Count Olaf's marriage plan wouldn't work." "What are polygamists?" Violet asked. "Polygamists are people who marry more than one person," Klaus explained. "In the community, polygamists are breaking the law, even if they have married in the presence of a judge, with the statement of 'I do,' and the signed document in their hands. I read it here in the nuptial laws." "But we're not polygamists," Violet said mournfully. There were several more hours of silence. "We could break these bottles in half," Violet said, "and use them as knives, but I'm afraid Count Olaf's troop would overpower us." "You could say 'I don't' instead of 'I do,'" Klaus said, "but I'm afraid Count Olaf would order Sonny dropped out of the tower." I certainly would," Count Olaf said, and the children jumped. They had been so involved in their conversation they hadn't heard him come up the stairs and open the door. He was wearing a fancy suit, and his eyebrow had been waxed so it looked shiny as his eyes. Behind him stood the hook-handed man, who smiled and waved the hook at the youngsters. "Come, orphans," Count Olaf said. "It's time for the big event. My associate here will stay behind in this room and will keep in constant contact through walkie-talkies. If anything goes wrong in tonight's performance, your sister will be dropped to her death." Violet and Klaus looked at each other, and then at Sonny, who was dangling in her cage, and followed Count Olaf out the door. As Klaus walked down the stairs, he felt a heavy sinking in his heart, as all hope had left him. There truly seemed to be nowhere out of their predicament. Violet was feeling the same way until she reached out with her right hand to grasp the banister for balance. She looked at her right hand for a second and began to think. All the way down the stairs and out the door and the short walk down the block to the theater, Violet thought and thought and thought, harder than she had thought in her entire life. All right, we're done with 11 chapters. We're on page 133. We only have page 160 or something, so we're almost our way through our first book. Have a nice night. Go Wildcats.